Okay, so let's get started. Thank you, Austin, for coming to campus and spending time with us here.
Absolute pleasure to be here. Good to see all of y'all. Thank you for coming out tonight.
But you have a pretty remarkable actuarial history. When did you pass your first actuarial exam?
Well, I had a friend of mine who was down at that school you call A&M, and we went to high school together and took calculus together. And he used to come up on the weekends and visit his girlfriend back in Fort Worth. And I was still in high school at the time. He was a year above me. And he said, I heard something from the Aggie Math Club about being an actuary. And you got to take all these tests, and it's really hard, but at the end of it, it's a really nice career to have, and it's ranked really high. And I'm sure all of y'all have heard this kind of stuff about being an actuary. And he said, but I don't know about these exams. And I said, oh man, Matt, how hard can they really be? I said, let's just go buy this material. And we bought Coaching Actuaries. And I said, let's study for one and see what happens. And I'm 17 at the time. And so it was a couple of months after my 18th birthday, we went and sat P, and we both passed, and it worked out. And at that point, I think I was kind of hooked. But yeah, I came out of high school already with an exam passed, and that helped me to get to talking to people early on that were influential later, like Mark Maxwell, that's the director at the University of Texas, was impressed with that. So that helped me get a foothold anyways.
Okay, and then you went through the remaining exams, including the fellowship exams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
While you were, well, I guess some of the fellowship exams you probably did while you were a PhD student.
Right. Yeah. So I had 3 years at the University of Texas, and at the second semester there, and so I guess it'd be third quarter for y'all, right? COVID hit, and it tells my age, I guess. But I wound up back home, and I had no idea what to do other than play with the puppy dogs and hang out with my parents. So eventually I got bored, and I started taking actuarial exams. Had 7 of them under my belt, close to the ASA by the time I finished at Texas. And I went to Mark Maxwell, and he said, well, the best thing you can do, he said, you're too far along for a master's. Why don't you apply for a PhD? Waterloo's, in his opinion, the best PhD that you can do in actuarial science. And so I applied, and by the grace of God, got in up there. And then my advisor started encouraging me to take the fellowship exams. And so I just finished up in March and went to the FAC and got the fellowship.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you, sir.
Something else you should know about Austin, he's also the recipient of a very prestigious award.
So the James C. Hickman Scholarship, covers PhD candidates that are also pursuing a fellowship. And so I was very lucky to have gotten that award earlier in this year too. And so
and Hickman was at UT Austin, wasn't he?
No, I don't know.
Or was he at Wisconsin?
He was at Wisconsin for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. He was at UW-Madison. Yeah. But he was kind of one of these first sort of people to bridge that gap between practice and theory. And so he did a whole lot for the profession, I think, in terms of wanting people to simultaneously have research knowledge and practical knowledge.
Yeah, that's an important point. It must have been some time ago, because I've been volunteering for the SOA now for 30 years, and I never met Hickman. I think he'd retired already, or he was retiring. But at any rate, congratulations on that award.
Thank you.
So a lot of our students, I think, and probably you all, are very happy to graduate with undergraduate degrees and go work in industry. And you could have done that at UT Austin.
Well, I had offers on the table when I went out to Canada. Yeah.
But yet you chose to work and continue in research. What made you continue in research rather than into industry?
Well, in my opinion, there's sort of 3 levels to understanding stuff, right? And you come through your undergraduate, and I think you kind of hit the first 2. And the first 2 are, you understand what something is. You can describe it kind of in English, and you can think about this as applied to any of the actuarial concepts that you learn. So you understand kind of what something is and how it gets used, maybe. You understand, maybe from a math perspective, it's easier to say it this way. You understand how to calculate with something. where you learn what a model is and you learn how to calculate with it, how you can apply it directly. In this setting, this is how we do this. This is how we calculate this. And these are the results. Here's how we interpret them, right? The third level of understanding that I really don't think that you get much of, you might get a taste of it, a flavor for it in your undergraduate, is why things work the way they do and what happens when we break assumptions. And I think that that's something that you really only get a hold of by doing research. And it was always this thing in the back of my mind that I know what these things are. I know how to calculate with them. I can get results if I just follow the math and follow my nose. But what happens when we don't have these assumptions? What happens when things break down? How do we put the pieces back together? And I think those are questions that only research really at the end of the day can answer. And so that was always an itch for me, is that I really didn't understand why I was doing things in this particular way the whole time that I came through my actuarial education. And I wanted to understand that. And that's what led me really to research.
And you'll be graduating next middle of next year.
Yes, sir.
That's good. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Tell us a little bit, and then we'll move into, I mean, by the way, I don't really want to talk here. I'd much rather you ask questions. Or played the, what's this?
The Kahoot, right?
Yes, yes. Play that as soon as, but I have one more question. Tell us a little bit about this area of research, particularly the reinforcement learning part, which I'm beginning, having listened to you a few times now, to understand what that is.
So to put it simply, you have I don't know how many of you have seen like short-term actuarial math exam, or and I don't know, they call it what is it now? ASTEM, these kinds of things.
This is Duncan's class.
There you go. Yeah, okay, yeah, absolutely.
183.
5 on the CIS track.
Yeah, on the CIS track, right. So you have risk models for frequency and severity, right? But what happens when you misspecify those risk models? I mean, you can go through pricing and reserving and all of these different things, but what happens when you miss something maybe in the tail of those models? They're thin tail. I mean, all of you are familiar with the 2008 crash that everybody attributes to this fellow from Waterloo that came up with this Gaussian copula method, and everybody said, oh, there's thin tails, right? Insurance risk has fat tails, right? It has heavy tails. And you can misspecify something about a model that ultimately misspecifies your tail risk, and that's what can cause your company to go bankrupt, right? So how do you deal with this uncertainty? There's a whole lot of research that has to do with secondary models to deal with uncertainty. And so what we've done is, through reinforcement learning, is by making no other assumptions than the classical modeling assumptions, you can develop programs that learn over time. And so this is something that I think is really important, not just in the very specific continuous time framework that we're dealing with, but also in a discrete time, more general framework, this concept of reinforcement learning. You have a random system that you have to interact with. You have to set up some kind of parameters, some kind of guess, right, in order to have a risk model. But you have observations of this random system that tell you how well you did, right? And then you have to update your beliefs, and you have to update these actions that you're taking by selecting these randomized parameters. And when you have models where you're not really certain what that random environment is based off of, you need to have some system that can learn. And that's what reinforcement learning is all about, is designing a system that can learn in the face of randomness and also in the face of uncertainty, and something that can ultimately tell you what the right answer is given enough data. And so all that we've done in our research is broken that down to a minimally parameterized model. So you only have a few parameters. You don't have this giant neural network that you have to fit to this thing. And that provides interpretability. And so that's a little bit about the reinforcement learning research. But ultimately, you have to deal with that uncertainty somehow. And I think that learning is probably the best way that you can do that. Reinforcement learning is probably the best, whether that's through AI or whether that's through these methods that we're kind of championing. I think that that's a direction that this field can take that will change the game. Because you have, in machine learning, you have kind of three paradigms, right? You have statistical learning methods, right? Those are applied all throughout the exams. Y'all have seen those, SRM, all this kind of stuff, apply this, right? You have generative AI. I'm sure everybody in this room has used ChatGPT at some point, right? and maybe not for your homework assignments, but you have generative AI that can tell you something that generate data, right? So you have statistical learning methods, you have generative AI, and then reinforcement learning really is its own paradigm that has not been applied at all in this field, but can solve problems dealing with this high level of uncertainty that really, at the end of the day, can cause bankruptcy and can cause insurers to fail, or at the very least, cause you to lose money. Right. And so reinforcement learning is really its own paradigm that hasn't been explored in this field. And that's what I'm trying to bring to the table with my research, is this idea from AI that really nobody has seen yet. And so that's one stream of research that I'm working on right now that I think is kind of going to be my thesis at the end of the day.
So how many of you have had an internship? 1, 2, 3.
Three in the back. Yeah.
3 or 4 of you. My assumption as somebody who worked in industry for many, many, many years is that what actuaries do is, so you could do this, you could do reinforcement learning and all this modeling and really interesting stuff. But what do you spend your time doing as an actuary? Trying to get the data fixed. Because the data is really bad. But if you really had access to good, fast, accurate data, you could apply some of these methods, I think. But at the end of the day, it falls apart because you really have problems with data.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's one of the things that any kind of AI system is going to suffer from, is small amounts of data. I mean, even if you think about Bayesian learning, everybody in here has probably, at least seen Bayes rule at some point, or a naive Bayes model, right? If you have small amounts of data, that completely changes your posterior distribution when a new data point comes in. Your posterior is going to wildly vary. So, I mean, even the simplest learning methods are totally violated when you have limited data or bad data, right? And so I think that's going to be a key issue going forward, is in addition to all of this actuarial knowledge, you also need to become kind of a data engineer in order to apply even the simplest of models, right? I mean, unless you go the realm of robustification and things like that, and that's a separate field. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm, those of you who don't know me, I'm a health actuary, so I deal in medical stuff, but most health actuaries at least work in Excel. They don't get beyond Excel. You never get to the point that you're working in. All this, all these models, complicated models that you deal with.
Right.
We're dealing with simple Excel models.
Well, and there's a row limit on Excel. I don't know if y'all know this. You can't fit too much data in Excel.
We discovered that. But yeah, that's the reality that actuaries work in. Welcome to the profession. If you have questions, ask Austin. He's here. He can tell you, he can give you advice on how to pass exams, because he's passed a lot of them.
Yes, if it's not Excel, then what programming language are you using for like modeling and?
Well, everything I do, I write myself in Python.
Python.
And if you know Python and a little bit of C, that goes a long way, pretty much. But you have to understand how some of the stuff from C gets wrapped into Python. But at the end of the day, I think sometimes R is faster for certain stuff. But as far as actually building models that somebody else can go in and parse, I think Python's closer to English, and people can understand what you're doing a little bit better. So I like Python a lot.
Yeah, I don't know what the CAS is doing now. You would know, Sean, but the SOA is still using R for our exams, particularly PA and ATPA. But I don't think this is we're looking again at the associateship exams, and I think we've got to look at incorporating Python now because I think the industry's moving beyond R into Python nowadays.
There's some things you can do in R that you can't. So certain statistical methods that you really have to do in R or write yourself, and so that's something that you have to keep in mind too. But I think ultimately, if you're going to write software that's going to eventually be read and understood by somebody else, I prefer the syntax of Python.
That's what I'm hearing in my company. Yeah. That we always used to do everything in R until I sold the company, and now we have engineers and they demand Python. Yeah, that's the story. Other questions? Or should we play Kahoot? Yes, Angela.
Going back to what you were saying before with like like thin tails and like thick tails. Do you think you can expand on that a little bit for like maybe some people who don't understand what that means?
Yeah, so sure. So the thinnest possible tail of a distribution that you can have. So I'm talking about the part of the distribution that goes out into the distance, right? So
You have
here's
expo markers on a whiteboard behind you if you want to use.
yeah, that's probably a much easier way of describing this, right? So you have a claims distribution, right? So let's see if these work. It's always a miracle when you come into a room if
You're out of luck.
yeah,
No,
if the whiteboard markers work.
Get it in the.
Yeah, there we go. So I'm talking about what happens as you get further and further out into the distance, right? So this is your probability density function, right? And so X is our claims here, right? So the thinnest possible tail that you can have is a zero tail, right? So here's the maximum claim that you can possibly have. After that point, everything's zero, right? And then after that, you can have thicker tails by, say, you start out up here and you have a distribution that looks like that goes out to infinity. And maybe that's an exponential distribution or a gamma distribution. And then you can have another distribution that comes in that kind of layers over the top of this, right? So I'm talking about the width of this distribution as you go out to infinity, right? And so that's what we talk about a heavy or a thick tail versus a thin tail versus here you have no tail, right? And so distributions that in another terminology dominate by having a density that's larger for larger values. And so we talk about first and second order stochastic dominance. And so that's a distribution that has higher likelihood of having higher values. That's all that a thick tail represents, right? And so if you believe that this is your claims distribution, this box here, and you observe something that's out in the tail, maybe you move your box a little bit. But if the distribution looks like the top one up here, eventually you're going to have to realize that your uniform distribution doesn't work very well. Right.
Also very difficult to estimate because you have so few observations out there.
And that's the other part of it, right? Is you can tell that the probability of seeing something shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. And so yeah, eventually it's very difficult to estimate what the tails are going to look like.
And interesting actuarial work, but difficult catastrophe modeling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's when you're really far out in the tails, right?
When you're really far.
And so, like I'm saying, if you have a distribution that doesn't have thick enough tails or doesn't have maybe you even have the right distribution to fit to the claims data, but your parameters are wrong, right? That's a form of model misspecification. And so that's what I'm talking about is we need more machine learning type algorithms that can update themselves to learn these things.
That's another interesting topic because it comes up actually a lot in my work is model error.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about model error.
Well, you can have model error in a couple of different ways. You can have like what we're talking about with model misspecification error, and then you can talk about actual to expected, right? And so out of those two, I mean, one of them is you assume the model's right, and here's just some random variation. That's actual to expected analysis. And the other one is your model is completely wrong in the first place, right? And so having people that understand error in modeling or people that are model validators, I think those are the people that make a whole lot of money, right?
Interesting. I did a paper a couple of years ago with one of the 296 groups on model error in Medicare.
Mm-hmm.
There's a Medicare risk contract that a lot of provider groups enter. We talked a little bit about that. And there's assumptions that lie behind it, but the problem that the model error problem is that it can appear that you've either made a profit or made a loss when you haven't really made a profit or loss, and that has to do with the shape of the distribution. So yeah, we did the work for that we did the work for that in 296 with students and then published a paper on it.
Well, that's an excellent opportunity to be able to have that at an undergraduate level for people.
Yeah, you don't know about this, but we have the BS-MS program here. Alex was in that last year in 296. think Alicia's in it this year. Angela's in it this year. And we do heavy duty research, and I probably published 8 or 10 papers over the last number of years with students.
That's an excellent way of doing it, to
Yeah.
get people involved in research early.
Because normally you'd wait till you're a PhD student like you to publish.
Right. Well, and at the University of Texas, we had what's called the Freshman Research Initiative too. And so I participated in that. We were doing petroleum geostatistics actually, which was completely different
but
than.
very appropriate to Texas.
Absolutely. Well, we were funded by an oil company, right? But later on I was.
We don't have any of those in California.
And later on, I mentored some students that were involved in that. And so, but getting people involved in and showing them what research can do early on is a long way to answering, I think, that third part of understanding that I was talking about.
You know that Santa Barbara used to be a big oil producing area.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, it was Santa Barbara that gave rise to the EPA. There was an oil spill off Santa Barbara during, I think, the Nixon administration. I was around at that time. You all weren't. But yeah, that was an oil spill off California, off Santa Barbara, that gave rise to the EPA.
There you go.
But we managed
there's a source of funding for geostatistical research.
No, we've managed to get rid of it since then. But Alex, you were in 296. What was your experience in 296? Not to put you on the spot, but how did you like 296?
Yeah, so it's like so I guess some of you have taken project-based courses like 131 or 174, basically applying the theoretical knowledge that you have learned in lectures and implement them in your models through like coding-based projects. So 296, from my experience, we were working on a project by predicting no-shows in dental appointment. That is like you made an appointment with a dental practice and you did not show up. And we're using some information like the demographic information and the weather conditions to predict whether the patient will show up or not. So in that way, we'll be able to save some money for the dental practice because the dentist and then the front desk have something to do throughout the day if we predict everything right. And if we think a patient will not show up to a dental appointment, they'll be able to substitute someone else that is called overbooking to save some money for the practice. And it was pretty much like a machine learning exercise, but in a much larger scale because it's a real world data supplied by actual dental practice management company. And you'll need to use machine learning models like in 131 or some other models that you have not been exposed to maybe. It's a bit of exploration at the beginning, but overall, especially if you have some type of background in theoretical knowledge classes, the upper divisions, PSTAT classes, will be able to really apply what you have learned in these projects.
And so that's kind of going from the first level that I'm talking about the what, you understand what something is, and then this is giving you an opportunity to really apply it.
Yeah, exactly.
And then that's it. If you want to go deeper, then you work with Ian and you can understand how things change when models break. Another thing on model error is what do you do when the parameters change over time, right? So you have maybe these are the claims that have to do with some kind of weather related event, and you have climate change that changes the parameters over time, right? How can you assume in a lot of cases IID observations, right? And so this breaks the second I, right? They're not identically distributed anymore, even if maybe you can say they're independent through time. But which is also that's another thing. But to say that they're not identically distributed, then how do you update the model's understanding of what the parameters are, how they're changing? And so that's where you again really need these kinds of learning procedures to come in and understand how the model's parameters are changing, even if the model itself, the distribution is still valid. How do these parameters change with time as a function of time? So that's another thing to go back to modeling.
Yeah, that's when I called Professor Peters to help.
There you go.
My next question is, you mentioned independent and identically distributed. Is that something in like the industry, like actuaries working at insurance companies? Is that an assumption they always use, just IID everything? Or are there times or examples?
Consciously or unconsciously?
Yeah, I think
I'm assuming it's unconscious because it's kind of something that
So somebody said, was it you who said this? Somebody said it in the last day or so, that actuaries just basically ignore the reasonability of data. They just proceed as though there's no
That doesn't sound like me.
assumptions. No. Somebody said that to me.
Uh-huh.
I forget who it was, but yeah, so much time, I keep making this point, so much time in the real world is spent just collecting the data, forget the IID-ness.
Yeah.
I think the main reason why I brought that up is because when I think to Mrs. Duncan's class or like exam 5 material is loss triangles. In order for like the loss triangle procedure to really happen, you have to assume all these in all these independent exposures, all these exposures are independent and roughly identical, which is like something that's
No.
Well, when
Just
you're talking
independent.
the exposure level, it could be the same
Yeah.
policyholder multiple times too, which would violate that.
Have you done work in loss triangles?
Well, for STAM, and that was about it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's another whole area which I think is interesting. And Peters does work in that area. Angela, what are you working on this year with your group in 296?
Research project is adjusting mortality curves to account for like opioid deaths. So far, all we're doing is like a lot of like combing through our data because the data is like so messy and like
What did I say?
we're like trying to find data that's like good and we have enough of it. And then because we're still in the early stages for us, it's a lot of us we're all actually masters, so like some of us haven't taken a lot of like graduate classes yet, so there's like a lot of knowledge that we have to like catch up ourselves. So it's a lot of like reading research papers, or not research papers, but like textbooks and like kind of like I've never learned machine learning before, so it's like definitely like catch up time for me.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a real world problem. Interestingly, opioid deaths is something that this is. I'm going to vent for a minute about actuarial research. You know who did the work and won a Nobel Prize for opioid deaths? Not an actuary, but an economist. And I think that happens too often, that actuaries are doing, maybe they're just spending their time trying to gather the data together, but Angus Deaton is quite a famous economist who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago for his work on, he showed that in the United States, there had been a spike in the deaths of younger to middle-aged men, particularly, which he called deaths of despair, because they often are addicted to opioids and they live in areas where they're unemployed or all sorts of reasons, but opioid deaths had spiked, and he won the Nobel Prize for this. And it happens too frequently that actuaries are not the ones publishing in these areas that are sort of important in attention getting. When did you last hear about an actuary getting attention, other than the actuary in the $1 billion bubble? Are you familiar with the $1 billion bubble? No? Well, you will become familiar with it when you go to the fellowship admission course. It was very briefly an actuary who tried to solve a problem in a real world problem in a company where the company was not making its earnings at the end of the quarter. And his boss, the president, asked him to try to fix this. And so it was a publicly traded company and the stock price depended on the earnings. So what he did was to construct an entirely phony insurance pool,
line,
which he then reinsured. And the reinsurance was, which happens in life insurance, you can actually get back more than 100% of the premium. So he would pay $100 for premium, but the reinsurer would pay him back $150, which is a great deal for the company. And it boosted the earnings at the end of the quarter. And the actuary did this, even though it was, I guess it was illegal. It's definitely unethical. And in those days, there wasn't a code of ethics for the actuaries. So but
Was
whatever.
this the whole AIG and Gen Re thing, or is this something?
No,
else?
this is 30 years before.
Yeah,
This is back in the 70s. This is
Okay.
when I was a student. But but the idea was he would reverse it at the end of the quarter. They'd make enough money. He could just retrocede the reinsurance back, pay them off, and everybody be happy. But of course, what happened next quarter? They were short of earnings again. So he had to construct more policies and reinsure more policies until there were actually more phony policies in the company than there were real policies.
Oh,
And eventually the whole thing, there was a whole secret block of business that only the actuaries had access to because it was completely phony and reinsured. Anyway, why were they talking about $1 billion bubble?
That was the last time an actuary got any attention.
He got a lot of attention for that. He went to prison and he got struck off the actuary list. But you will encounter that at some point. If you remain in the actuarial profession, you will encounter this movie. It starred James Woods, if you know who James Woods is. I guess you're too young.
is this the only actuary movie out there?
No, there's a second one called What About Schmidt, which starred somebody quite famous. I forget now who. But the role was in the movie, the role is an actuary, but it has really nothing to do with actuarial sciences.
Is that the Jack Nicholson one?
Yeah, maybe it was Jack Nicholson. But the original story was about a lawyer. But for some reason, they changed it from lawyer to actuary. Those are the only two actuaries.
That's something that you saw before the advent of the quant too in finance, was that actuaries were really publishing a lot of financial engineering research too. And I mean, practicing actuaries were looking into this stuff. And so then eventually that became kind of its own branch of math and got pushed into the finance world. But originally actuaries were the financial engineer.
Yes, that's why we have what's his name? 171 matching. Who's doing 171? Oh, you haven't got to that yet.
It's Professor Peterson's class 171.
Yes,
What
I
part
used
of
to
it?
teach 171.
Is this on Exam FM?
Yes,
Oh, it's
Oh, Reddington?
Reddington.
Yeah.
So Reddington was essentially, he was president of the Prudential Insurance, chief actuary of the Prudential Insurance Company, and he developed this whole theory of matching. But back in those days, this is the 1970s, the actuaries were the financial engineers, but we lost that ground. Just like we sort of lost the ground on mortality to Angus Deaton and the economists, or the people who work in mortality. Actuaries always seem to be losing ground. It gets absorbed by these other fields of research. Yeah, and then they take over, and we just get, our little world narrows down.
Well, and I think part of it is you don't.
I told you I was going to vent.
You don't have practicing actuaries that do research.
I think that's part of it. I do think that is part of it.
Yeah.
And there's so many problems out there that you should be excited about. So when you become a real actuary working in a company, keep your eyes open.
Well, and for example, I'm good friends with this Italian CEO that has I don't know, more or less startup insurance company, and then he's also doing some reinsurance stuff. But he started out, he wanted to partner with a group that had weather stations and could monitor the weather, and he wanted to use that to design parametric insurance contracts. And so parametric insurance is just, you have some indicator. If the indicator is above a level, a payment gets sent out to the policyholder, right? So you have a parameter, and that parameter basically dictates whether or not a payment goes. And so he wanted to design parametric insurance contracts for farmers in Kenya to be able to either, when the weather was good or bad, when you had too much rainfall or not enough rainfall, you could give them small amounts of money in order to replant their crops for the next year. And everything was based essentially on cryptocurrency transfers to these farmers. And that's because you can't really get general insurers to go in or classical insurers to go into these markets to ensure the crop risk there. And so he had to find non-traditional financial backing, and so he did it through crypto. So this is a real company that he's trying to establish. It's a good idea, right? But basically, I mean, I don't think any of what I just said really is traditional actuarial work, right? So he needed, in the first place, he needed to figure out how to design this securitization in order to have financial backing through crypto like he wanted to. He also needed people to do contract design for the parametric insurance and be able to set up agreements between the farmers and the insurer through the contracts. And then he also needed ultimately a system that would learn about these risk processes over time. Like I'm saying, this is something that was affected obviously by, or is currently affected by climate change, right? So he needs a system that'll learn more about the risk process over time because it's going to be emerging data that he collects because nobody's ever done this before. So he needs a system to update these contracts and update the parameters over time. So that's a real need that helps people.
Sounds like reinforcement learning.
Well, this is why this guy and I were talking, right? Is that I'm doing this RL stuff. And the thing is, though, is that those are three really essential needs: the securitization, the contract design, and the learning process. Those are three essential needs for this business that, if it didn't exist, would have these people kind of out in the cold, right? This is a real risk to real people that they don't have access to an insurance company, and they need something non-traditional to design a solution to it. And that's, I mean, right there's a real world example of why research matters and why understanding more than just the traditional actuarial education matters. And that's one example anyways.
That's a good example. Angela?
Good question, I think. So we're coming up on time, but I have a question for you regarding something that's less about research. Can you walk us through like your exam or your credential like journey? Like how many exams did you pass in undergrad? How many exams did you pass like when you were doing your PhD stuff?
Right.
Do you think it was like different studying for them when like you were in undergrad versus graduate?
Yeah, it is different the further up you go the exam track. You start out where basically repetition is the name of the game for PNFM, right? You have to understand the wording that they're going to use. I mean, even to an extent for the life insurance question, some of the wording can be tricky. I taught that class and all the students were talking about the wording is tricky on the problems. I said, well, this is how the SOA words problems, right? So repetition is
the life contingency.
Yes.
Think that wording is complicated?
Me?
No,
The
the
students. The students think that the wording was complicated for LTAM problems. You have to go look at some of the LTAM.
Interesting.
And well, it's the same thing that they complain about with when I was a TA for interest theory at Texas. They would complain about the wording on how the interest rate was calculated was tricky, right? I mean, things like this, right?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, you have to be able to figure out what the question's asking, not necessarily what the words say.
Right. Exactly. So you have to be able to read the question and parse what it's getting at.
And know immediately what it's getting at because of the time constraint.
There is a time constraint too. And so repetition is the name of the game early on. And the further up that you go, the more concepts that you need to understand, as opposed to necessarily, I mean, you're back at that first level of understanding of what something is and kind of how it fits into this broader ecosystem of math, as opposed to really even understanding how to apply it in practice. I mean, when you get to PA, I think a lot of the models that you learn about, you don't actually have to use on exam day, right? You have to know more conceptually about the models than necessarily how to actually calculate with them.
Right.
And then when you get into the fellowship exams, really it becomes all conceptual. And so you have to have there's a professor at University of Texas named Joel Nybert. He started out at USC. He got his PhD out here. Joel Nybert. He's a really nice guy. And he always describes this web of mathematics. And so I took a few classes with him and he influenced my teaching style a little bit. But he talks about a web of mathematics to understand how the different concepts are related to one another. And you really have to have that for the fellowship exams where you understand how these different things interrelate. And so that's the most important thing, I think, for the FSA exams. But yeah, it changed a lot as I progressed through the system. I think coaching actuaries helped out pretty much every exam that I took in my undergraduate. I took the exam first and then I took the class at Texas. And so my GPA was really good at Texas because I already knew the stuff right. And when I got to grad school, the other thing that I'll say, this is a word of warning when you get to the FSA, play to your strengths when you get to the FSA. Because when you're in practice and, you know, say you're working at a life insurance company, do the dang life insurance track. You know, play to your strengths, because I had a buddy of mine, close friend, that was doing life insurance in consulting. And I said I was going to do the quantitative finance track because I was playing to my strengths. I had taken these classes in the PhD that helped me out. And he said, "Oh, well, I'll join in with you and I'll study with you and we'll go do it together." And man, it was like, I think he had a 2, you know? And I felt really bad, but I said, "Look, I told you, you should do the life insurance track. It's what you're good at. It's what you have expertise in." So I probably would have got a 2 on the life insurance exam because I didn't know the stuff, you know? And so that's another word of warning when y'all get there, is that that's a really important thing to do when you get there. And so I looked at it as, well, I already took all these stochastic calculus classes. Let me go apply those to the exams and I'll probably do well. And it worked out.
There is 2 points. One is that we used to see, not all that frequently, but often enough that it is problematic, that some students do really well at the repetitive memorization type questions that you get for the ASA, and then cannot pass the fellowship exams because the nature of the 2 exam structures is different.
Yes.
And what the fellowship, this is because I did the UK exams, what the UK exams used to say was the fellowship exams are all about, you're running an insurance company, here's a problem, how do you solve it? Now, I think the SOA is somewhat similar to that, although there's more memorization in the SOA fellowship exams.
I would agree with that.
But our fellowship exams were very much intended to be much more sort of real world, in the sense of, you've already learned all the theoretical stuff. Now, here's a problem. What do you apply to it? And I think that is something you need to think about if you're going on to the fellowship, that you're going to have to sort of change your whole way you think about exams.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to rely a lot more on this web of interrelations than just strictly memorizing each individual thing. It's more important to understand how they're related and connect as a whole, as concepts.
Yeah. I think I failed all of my associateship exams the first time. I don't think I passed one of them the first time, but I passed the fellowship exams first time because it was much more, oh, I know how to run companies.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Well, at least to satisfy the examiners, I knew.
So you guys mentioned that you think compared to like quants or economists, actuaries generally, especially like actuaries in the field, don't really feel like a strong incentive to commit to doing research. Do you think that is just like a lack of incentive or like a inappropriate skill set? Because also like most industry actuaries are just spending most of their time in Excel rather than learning a lot of the things that you would need to know to commit to research.
It's a problem not only from the industrial perspective, it's also a problem with the way that research is framed. There's a massive disconnect between what's getting published in actuarial research papers and what's actually being done in practice. And so it starts from both sides, really. On the one hand, you're right, there's no incentivization for the industry actuary to pursue reading these papers. But on the other hand, there's no incentivization necessarily to have purely practical research getting done, right? From the research perspective, you want it to be mathematical, you want to prove things. And you sometimes kind of got to go a little bit out in the left field and a little bit more out in the left field to get the proofs out. And then that doesn't satisfy the practicing actuary that wants to immediately apply these concepts. So there's a massive bridge that needs to be constructed between these two. And the president of the SOA here can answer to his initiatives.
You could get me on a rant on this one. I think part of the issue is going to be that you don't learn enough in undergraduate actuarial studies to really be able to address these issues, or even to read the typical papers in the actuarial journals.
Yes.
And there's another sort of dirty secret to this, which is the professors in actuarial and other departments are rewarded for the volume and complexity of the math they publish. Which makes it almost impossible for those of us who are not trained in more advanced math
Yeah.
to understand what's going on. So that's a real problem. If you have any interest in research, you probably are going to have to do some more advanced courses, number one. Number two, and I don't know how to solve this problem, but it's been around a long time. And as I said, I'll rent. Companies don't have a lot of regard for academics, and academics find it almost impossible to apply themselves to company problems. And there's that gap. You talked about the gap. And I've solved some of that gap myself, but I've done it as a consultant rather than as a theoretical academic. Sometimes it works. I mean, sometimes a company will hire an academic for a real problem, and your Kenya farmer guy did that, apparently.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it is a real gap, and it seems to be worse in actuarial science than in other disciplines.
Well, and you talk about engineers.
Engineers do it all the time.
That's the thing, is that the work that gets published in, say IEEE or whatever, that stuff is getting applied in real time. The engineers in practice are actually looking at that and applying it. And what's so different about, the engineering field than, actuarial work? I don't understand why we can't necessarily have.
And I
similar
think you see in companies as well that undergraduates who've learned sort of more newer techniques, or maybe they were graduate students who learned new techniques, will go to their bosses who are like me and learn. I mean, I'm pre-Excel. The first insurance company I worked in didn't have a computer. They'll go to the boss and say, we should think about this application to some problem. And the boss will say, well, I don't understand that. Go back and use Excel. That's the way companies run now.
I think you have to start with a problem from the industry side. And you look at it as an academic, and you kind of back up into a larger framework that this thing could fit into, or a larger class of problems that this thing fits into. Solve that in the larger class of problems, and then work back down to the use case, right? And I think that's the formula.
Yeah, but there's still such a gap. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, as most of us here are looking to go into the industry and working for an insurance company, I guess my question is, what advice do you have for us to, when we go into those internships and full-time positions, what should we be looking for to help with this problem we've been discussing?
Well, you've got to look for areas where you can play in the sandbox a little bit, right? I mean, you gotta find, if you're interested in doing research and thinking this way, at least, you've got to find companies that are willing to kind of give you a little bit of freedom to run with that, right? But what you can start doing right now is, as a student, is you take the things that they're teaching you about in courses, and go read the original papers. If you don't understand something, go find a reference on that. Ask ChatGPT. That's a great way to get an intuitive understanding of stuff, right? That's the first thing that you can do right now, is instead of just learning about something and how to apply it and how to calculate with this, go read how it was developed and what assumptions go into it. And then you know how to break it down and what happens when those assumptions are violated, which I think is the key to that third level of understanding. But you have to go to do that. You have to see how it was built. And to see that, you have to go to the original research paper. So that's something you can do right now. But ultimately, if you're really interested in doing research, you have to find a company that'll let you play outside of the box on stuff. And that's something that I think companies may say that they want, and then you get into the role and do Excel, do linear regression.
Can I make one point before we do this?
Yeah.
I want to make one point, because I think this is important as you get out there. Number one thing you have to do if you really are going to be an actuary is pass the exams. Don't worry about research. But like everything at that point, but get through the exams in 1 year or 2 years, and then you can worry about it. But like everything else in life, it's about relationships. You've got to develop relationships upwards in whatever company or setting you're in, where you can have that sort of dialogue with people who are managing the company and who face problems that you don't face. And you've got to think about what problem they have and how you might have a solution to it. So relationship there. relationship with other actuaries. There are plenty of opportunities for you to interact with other actuaries who are doing interesting things. And then don't forget your professors. Stay in touch with your professors. We tell our students, Mrs. Duncan and I tell our students, come back anytime and we'll take you to dinner or lunch, or, you know, you can have a discussion about whatever's going on in your social circle or your company, whatever. But professors are there for you to tap into knowledge. And if you've done the relationship upwards and you're hearing about problems in your company, then let the academics know. Maybe they have a suggestion. So like everything else in life, it's not what you know, it's who you know.
It's very well put, I think.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Austin, is there like an email that maybe our students can reach you at if they're interested in more?
Yeah, so I have a website and I have a LinkedIn. It's austinriis-due.com, and it's just Austin Riis-Due on LinkedIn. Y'all can find me on there.